Voila. So what we're going to learn first is a question, a bit kind of duality lines. We've got 3 here. So I want to hear from your perspective whether retrospectives are magical on the right-hand side of the scale, or they're thumbs down experiences. Are they light bulb moments? Or are they confusing? Or are they powerful or frustrating, like your laptop, you just want it to explode? The way you can share your personal view is by grabbing these little post-it icons and dragging them onto the scales accordingly. If you haven't used Miro before, just make sure on the left-hand side of your screen here, you've got that little blue cursor selected. You can also press V on your keyboard. That shortcut will enable that to happen. And then you can just left click and drag any of those post-it notes on the scale like I'm doing now. When you've done that for each of those 3 duality lines, there is also a series of post-it notes below. And I'd love for you to share, just in a few words, what retrospectives mean to you. All right, the votes are coming in. Primarily so far, they're on the right-hand side of the scale. So more positive than negative experiences, which is great. If you didn't catch it on the meetup detailed, by the way, this talk today is going to explore lots of the tips, tricks, strategies, flim-flams, hacks, gambits, and otherwise that I use to create an environment for continuous improvement. Once we've warmed up with these little icebreaker questions, what I'll do is, in true choose your own adventure style, I will empower you, the audience, to vote on the direction this conversation goes. There are lots of tips and tricks. We will either be focusing on the foundations for continuous improvement, the facilitation styles, some formats, like as some of you may know, I'm a big fan of using a range of formats to do retrospectives in, or finishing up that all-important end of the retrospective where you turn those great insights into actions. So you will have the ability to influence the direction that we go in, and you'll do so again by voting. But let's see what some of these post-its are saying. So retrospectives are galvanizing. They are catalysts for change. They're about empowerment, a continuous improvement mindset. They're a connection between teams, improving your ways of working, harnessing the collective experiences on how we do things. We've got a yellow comment that's appeared saying it's a team bonding session. Absolutely, couldn't agree more. They're a safe space, or they should be a safe space. Annalise, don't worry if you aren't able to participate on Miro, you can type in the chat like you're doing now. So feel free to share in that way. Miro, by the way, no one should require an account to use Miro. It's just a link that anyone should be able to access. As long as you've got access to a web browser, you should be able to access this. There's no sign-ups or logins required. And yes, it is a feedback loop. Okay, right, so we've got some good insights as to what we currently believe retrospectives are. Now it's time to choose your adventure, folks. So I'm going to bring your attention to this part of the board and begin your votes. Again, grab the little post-it icons, and you have 2 votes each to choose which of these sections of this talk you want to focus on first. The foundations of continuous improvement, facilitation styles and techniques, formats for retrospectives, or finishing up. And what I love about this choose your own adventure style is that I can deliver this talk 50 times and it always goes in a different way, depending on what the audience chooses. The facilitation is taking a huge lead so far. We'll give it another 10 or 15 seconds to get the votes in. Annalise, what are you feeling? I can see Sham's gone with facilitation as well. Shampa, sorry, it's shortened on my screen. All right, looks like facilitation. Okay, so where we're going to start is over here. Now, question for you folks. How does silence feel during a retrospective, or in fact, any meeting? Let's say you're facilitating a session, you ask a question of the audience, and it goes silence. On this scale here, does it feel really uncomfortable on the left-hand side of the scale, or have you got this? Are you comfortable with it? Again, grab the little post-it notes and rate how you feel when you hear silence in a retrospective or any meeting, particularly if you're facilitating? Okay, mixture of responses. When I did this talk recently, it was such a split. There were loads of people on the left side. Some people had it in the middle. It was all over the place. Now, I will admit, folks, I'm someone who's facilitated hundreds and hundreds of retrospectives, loads and loads of meetings, and silence used to be this horrible thing for me. I felt compelled to puncture that silence with my own words. I felt, oh my God, I've asked the wrong question, or people are bored, or I've not been clear enough. And it was just really, really uncomfortable. And I felt like I needed to, break that silence. I should say something. I should use my own words to change the direction. I should try and make sure I was clear with them. The problem with that is, by doing that, I'm taking away people's ability to process their information, because people process information differently. You may be aware, I'm a talker. I like to talk, so I talk to think. Whereas some people, they like to think before talking, and they need a little bit of time to reflect and digest before coming up with a response. So there's lots of different personalities that comprise teams, and silence can be very powerful. There is a reason why the FBI and other people who interview people often, they use silence to their advantage. If you ask a question, and when you start to feel uncomfortable, you feel compelled to break that silence. If you just pause a little bit longer, often the other person that you've asked the question to feels compelled to add more and more detail. And that's an interview technique people use. So the same can apply with teams you're working with. Embrace silence. Silence is a positive. Of course, it's all dependent on the situation. If it's always silence, it's probably a negative. You want to probably watch out for that. But silence isn't always a bad thing. And in fact, there is a retrospective technique that you can use called the Silent Retrospective, which can celebrate silence even further. So is anyone familiar with silent retrospectives? Feel free to type a yes or no on the Zoom chat, sorry, or nods, or however you choose to interact. No? Okay. Yes, got a yes. So silent retrospectives are exactly as they sound. Basically, no one speaks during them. You set the ground rules, nobody speaks, you still respect each other, but the way it might work if you are physical or virtual is you'll set those expectations. People will add their comments on post-its, usually in a single color. And then if someone has to clarify, they're not sure, they want to clarify what something means, they might use another color and put it next to that one and maybe draw a little arrow to it to say, hey, I'd like to clarify that. But you still respect the silence. And what this can do is it can cause you to focus, because you have to, otherwise you can't get across, or you can't be clear on what you're doing. The flip side of this is if you're in a normal meeting or retrospective and you've got notifications here, there, and everywhere, your emails coming in, someone pings you on Slack, it's urgent, they need a response, it can be very easy to get distracted, especially where our attention spans are slipping. So if you were to click on this section here where it says there's a 3 little pigs visual, there is a YouTube video where a gen called Dov Sal, he introduced me to the concept of silent retrospectives. He will talk through that a little bit further and how to run it. But if you haven't tried silent retrospectives, I encourage you to give it a try. It can be great to get a team to really focus on how they can improve, and it can help you demonstrate that silence isn't necessarily a bad thing. Another thing about silence is that, and again, I'm sure many of you have experienced before, where meetings can be overtaken by the louder voices, those dominance hierarchies where the more confident, articulate, loud-spoken people say something, and quieter voices don't get their chance, their opportunity to have their say, whereas by embracing silence, by having rules like this, everyone gets their equal chance to participate. So again, something to give a go. The next one, and this one may surprise you, given that you all are, well, many of you are familiar that I love creating a range of different retro formats. Sometimes fixing the formats can help. So if you're working with a team that is perhaps new to doing retrospectives, they're new to agile ways of working, they're just getting their head around continuous improvement and why we use this feedback loop to continuously improve ways of working. If they're new to it, then simplicity can be very useful. Simplicity can be key. So a standard start, stop, continue, or a sad, mad, glad, or a liked, learned, loved, or 4 Ls, or any of those pretty repetitive formats can work. The key thing here is as long as those retros result in actionable improvements and the team doesn't mind continuing to use them and they remain engaged, then you're fine. There isn't necessarily need to flex the format or have all bells and whistles every time if the current format works for the team. The simple answer is to many questions is what works for the team? Ask the team what they would like to do. So don't be afraid of start, stop, continue. Don't be afraid of sad, mad, glad. I don't personally like them, but they can work for some teams. And with that note, I will encourage you to think about the fact that everything I share with you today, there are lots of approaches, styles, strategies you could try. They may not work for you. Some of them may not work at all. The important thing is they are experiments. They are options that you can add to your own tool belt, to your personal arsenal, and they are to be experimented with, tried, adjusted. And if they work, fantastic, amplify that. If they don't, dampen that, try something else. Everything needs to be taken into the context that you're working with, the people you're working with, and the culture you're working with. Okay. So the opposite of fixing the format is flexing the format. And this is the one that I'm most known for because I love creating me some retrospective templates. So I think I'm on retro template number 84, all of which are freely accessible on my website. There's no signups required. You can download them all. You can pull them into a Miro, a Mural, a Google Jamboards, a Lucid Spark, and I've given details on how to do that. But flexing the format can help keep things engaging and fresh, rather than asking what should we start doing and stop doing and continue doing, which can sometimes result in the same insights coming up retro after retro after retro. You could be asking various different questions. You could be doing the Queen themed rock band where you're playing Queen's music, Queen's discography in the background and asking things like, don't stop me now, playing the music. And it's about what should we continue doing, or under pressure, what's putting the team under pressure. You could be doing the dog meme retrospective where you invite the team to use various dog memes to provoke insights. You could be using Diwali and being inclusive of other cultures. You could be doing Journey, the rock band, and say, don't stop believing. What shouldn't we stop believing in as a team? What should we persevere with? Or any way you want it. If you could have it any way you want it in the next iteration, what would you try? What would you like to see changed? There are so many formats out there. And given that there's my own website, which has 84 templates, there is Steve Sampson-Jones, who's shared a number of them. Dave Westgard, I think, got 50 on his own website. You've got the Miroverse, which has got lots of them available. I used to use Tasty Cupcakes exclusively before I started creating things. There are so many formats out there that I believe that you could, if you were working with a team and doing retrospectives every 2 weeks, you'd probably not run out of formats after 10 plus years. There are so many options out there to keep things fresh, to keep your team engaged. And the consequence of an engaged team is better outcomes, better insights, and people that end up looking forward to retrospectives rather than dreading them. So I encourage you to try any of my retro templates. A bit of creativity, a bit of insights, or a bit of creativity, a bit of engagement, a bit of immersion into things that people love can be a much more enjoyable experience, because I believe the workplace can be fun if you allow it to be. Now, the next one, and it's sticking with on the facilitation styles. One of my most powerful retrospectives I've ever run was actually initially a huge failure. So I was doing a Back to the Future themed retrospective, which is more of a futurespective than a retrospective. And I was doing it with the senior leadership team, and I thought I came to this meeting full of energy and thinking, right, this format's going to land really well. And I got maybe 10 minutes in, and it was just failing miserably. They weren't connecting to it. It had been a very stressful time. It wasn't working for them. So sometimes all you need is an honest and open conversation about what needs to be improved most. You can just say, fuck the format, excuse my language, move the format aside and just focus on creating an environment without a fancy format that can be distracting and just having an open and honest conversation. The consequence of pivoting away from that, being agile about my approach, so I responded to change rather than following a plan, was that it was just a very open, honest conversation. They were more open and vulnerable with each other than I think they'd ever been. And we got to some really key insights that resulted in change. So if a format isn't working, don't try and stick with it necessarily. Ask what the team needs and if they want to try something different, and maybe just create the environment for an open and honest conversation. What is the one most important thing that we need to work on in the next few weeks? And I've highlighted here a bit of feedback that I have. I tend to get mostly good feedback about the formats I create, but a Scrum Master shared with me that they used my Home Alone retrospective around about Christmas time. Everyone loves Home Alone at Christmas. And one of the prompts in that retrospective template was keep the change, you filthy animal. You know what Kevin McAllister says, keep the change, you filthy animal, after watching a gangster film. And that was about, what should we leave behind about how we work? And one of his team, after running this with two teams, one team loved it, the other team, someone said the retro board was something they wanted to say keep the change to. It wasn't working for them. So it's not going to work for everyone. Experiment, try, but be empathetic about the situation. So if it doesn't work for someone, just maybe explore a little bit why. Maybe they weren't feeling that day. Maybe the format wasn't working for them. Invite them to be part of the future retrospective choice, and then they're less likely to be resistance, I find. Moving on then, has anyone ever tried rotating the person who facilitates a retrospective? Mike? Yeah? Tim? See heads nodding. Now, what I love about doing this is what I call the Facilitation of Flux. It's kind of medium level difficulty because it requires a bit of psychological safety in place. It requires a bit of support for those who haven't facilitated before. But why I like this is it builds into a team the collective responsibility and skill set for creating an environment for continuous improvement. So rather than becoming dependent on only one person, what you could do is say, hey, Tim, could you facilitate the next retrospective? And after that, 2 weeks later, Mike can take a turn. And you just make it a rotational thing. And each person brings their own style and energy and approach to doing it. And again, that can keep things fresh. But again, the important thing is it removes that dependency on a single person, typically a Scrum Master or an Agile coach or one single facilitator, and it turns continuous improvement and good retrospectives into a skill set the whole team has rather than something that an individual has. A personal value of mine is to make myself redundant, and this is one of the ways I do this. I aim to try and build that skill set into the team. So it's really easy to do. You do need to provide a little bit of support to people that have never done it before. Obviously, you can point them towards various resources out there. You can offer to provide a bit of one-to-one coaching for them to help them run through how it should work. You can support them on the day by being a kind of backup facilitator and providing feedback afterwards. But again, what this can do is build in the skill set, the collective skill for continuous improvement into a team. So I encourage you to try that if you haven't tried it before. Any questions on any of those plays before we move on to the next series? Mike, go for it.
Yeah, so in terms of other people facilitating, what I found works really well, you sometimes get people in a team who come to you and say, oh, this isn't working for me, or this problem or whatever. And if you can encourage them to take ownership of the problem and run a retro on it, again, it feeds into what you said. It encourages them to take the lead when they do see a problem, try and uncover why it's happening, try and effervesce that to the rest of the team, and really try and find solutions and not just talk about the problem.
Absolutely. Another approach that I like using is reverse brainstorming. So rather than framing it as just the problem, you could reverse it around. So you could say, rather than saying, how do we improve as a team, you could say, how do we get worse as a team? And use the negative side of things. And then, so a good example I like to give is, what one new feature could we add to our product that would drive away our customers? And then from that, you can work out, okay, what things could we add that would drive us to get more customers? And because humans have a negativity bias, sometimes it's easier to think of the negatives than it is the positives. So you can use reverse brainstorming technique. You can use this, I call it the world's worst play. So you can use this when you're creating a team charter, for example. You could say, right, what would the worst team look like? What are the markers of a worst team? How would the world's worst team communicate with one another? And then you can flip that around and generate things that the team wants to do. What would the best team look like as a consequence? And how do we want to commit to working with one another? So reverse brainstorming is a great way of getting people to think of different insights. Okay. Another thing I encourage you to try is escaping the environment. So bring your attention to here on the boards. Essentially, I would like you all to read this sentence here. Maybe someone wouldn't mind volunteering to read out loud. Any volunteers to do that?
I'll do it, Chris.
Go for it.
In this sentence, by the time you are done reading, you will have already skipped over the double the.
Yeah, so you've spotted it. But a lot of people, they'll read things like this and they won't spot the because our brains are amazing at filtering out things that aren't relevant to us. We can still interpret what that was intending to say, but we'll miss things. The same can be true when you spend ages on a document and you're writing it and you're writing and you write it and you've edited it and you checked it over and over. Then you send it to someone else and they spot loads of mistakes. And you're like, how did I miss that? How did I miss that? I looked at it repeatedly. So the same can be true of teams, right? Teams can get so entrenched in how they work, they could miss obvious things that they could be doing differently, obvious things that they could do to improve. So the escape the environment play is all about escaping your ways of working. So there's lots of ways of doing it. So you can literally physically escape your environment rather than sitting in your office and doing a retrospective. You could go out for a walk and talk. You can everyone get on a phone call and walk and talk through that way. As long as you've got someone, I guess, able to take down notes that and make that a rotational thing, that can be fine. You're physically escaping the environment in that way. You can have a guest facilitator to come along, someone external to the team that isn't entrenched with the ways of working, is able to help them spot things that are against their status quo. That person could be there just on a watching basis, an observation basis, and they can provide feedback in private, or they could be asked to actually step in and facilitate a little bit differently. And the other thing that, again, if you have the capacity to do so, I encourage you, just a bit like teams do, or people do pair programming, where two people come together and they review things and work on things together. You could encourage teams to pair with other teams, attend other teams' retrospectives, attend other teams' meetings, see how they work, and use that as a way of driving improvement. What you'll do there is foster relationships between those teams. You'll build networks, and you'll hopefully create more lessons being learned. So lots of ways to escape the environment, to avoid missing the obvious areas that you're so entrenched in that you forget and haven't been able to see for some time. Okay. I want to get a bit of interaction then. So the dealer's choice play. Question for you. We are now here. How does it feel when you're in a meeting and one person is calling people out one by one to share their views? Share on these post-it notes, type in the Zoom chat, or speak aloud. How does it feel in those situations? All right, so we've got creeping death, we've got stale. You're thinking about to say next when it's your turn, so you might not be paying attention to what people are saying because you're thinking about what to say next. It can feel pressured, it can feel formal, like you're being judged. Someone's writing like a status report, and that's what I was looking for. It is very status report-esque. I call this status report syndrome. This happens a lot where teams are either new to agile ways of working, or they've perhaps got an external person in who's got a very project management mindset in, and they go there and say, right, Tim, how are we doing with this? You know, now it's your turn, you share, and now it's your turn, you share. And it can, because it's a single person calling people out, it is very status report-esque. It's like everyone is being asked command and control to report back to that one person. So what I encourage when I'm facilitating ceremonies, meetings, retrospectives, or otherwise, is what I call dealer's choice. And there's lots of ways of doing this. I tend to go with an approach of the last person to join the meeting starts, and they're the first person to speak. And then once they've shared their update, whatever you want to call that, their progress for the day, or what they're going to focus on for the day, more importantly, because I don't tend to care about the past you can't change, but what they're going to do today to collectively help the team achieve its goals. Once they've shared, they nominate the next person to speak. So again, what we're doing here is we're building in a collective responsibility for group involvement, a collective responsibility for inclusion, and we're reducing the dependency on one single person to facilitate group discussions. So easy to do it. I tend to go with the last person to join nominates next. And again, what that can do is create an environment for inclusivity, collective discussions, rather than it being one person calling out you and you and you and you on a rotational basis. So give that a go sometime if you haven't tried that before. You have a question, Gordon?
Yeah, I think I've worked in a number of places where psychological safety has been an issue, and on occasion, just getting people to talk can be a challenge. So this feels like it might be the kind of thing that you might bring in after you've got a certain level of psychological safety in place.
I agree, yeah. So if you don't have a level of psychological safety in place, it might be difficult. But equally, I would say that the inverse, the flip side of this, if you've got one person just asking reports all the time, it's probably contributing to a reduced level of psychological safety in itself. So if you articulate to everyone that we're going to try this new approach, it's an experiment, it's not set in stone, something we're going to try, and you get to influence on how it works. What we're going to try is creating a group collective responsibility for sharing. We want everyone to feel able to speak up, and we're not doing status reports here. We are having a meeting that's focused on a feedback loop between the team that's for transparency and to help each other. So set that expectation early and then give it a try. It's probably better than the alternative. So last to speak nominates, and it builds a shared responsibility for group involvement. Okay, we are on the final few facilitation plays. So dad joke, compulsory dad joke. How much does a polar bear weigh? Who's got the answer to that question?
The no beer breaks the ice.
Yes, it breaks the ice. So anyone who's seen any of my templates will know that they've pretty much all got an icebreaker built into them. And the reason I do that is I'm very much a people first person. I hate the idea of people being thought of as just avatars behind a screen. We're beating hearts behind our laptops with likes and dislikes, preferences, passions, desires. And we often don't get to know each other well enough. And it's difficult building rapport and trust and a sense of community when we're not face to face. So it can be done by using icebreakers. I build it into most of my meetings. I'll tell you a story. I was working with a team in Mexico. They'd been together for about 1.5 years, and I was helping them with their agile ways of working. And I introduced icebreakers into their meeting because I wanted to liven things up a little bit and help them create a bit of community because they had a bit of morale issues. So this team who'd been working together for 1.5 years, after doing an icebreaker one day, and the way I tend to do it is I share a big list of potential questions they can ask, and again on a rotational basis, someone chooses one for the day, and they each take a turn to answer it. But the question was about what was your favorite childhood video game? So we ran this question, everyone answered. What we then realized through doing that was that 2 people in that team who'd worked together for 1.5 years, both played the same video game. They then agreed to play with each other the same game that evening together. And it was something they would never have learned about each other through their general work, because work was a very, meetings were a very work focused thing. As a result of introducing those icebreakers, that team, many of them were actually video gamers. Like we started having video game themed backgrounds to our teams spaces. We started having video game themed retrospectives. So that single act resulted in a rapid increase in the sense of community that team has. It's really easy to do an icebreaker. 5 minutes at the beginning of a meeting. I build them into all my retrospective templates. You can see a few examples that I will share here. So you've got the Taco Tuesday retrospective template, which was a challenge from Mike Cohen, has people building their own perfect tacos with these little images. You've got the Shaun of the Dead retrospective, where you ask, what's your zombie apocalypse plan? Are you going to go to the Winchester and wait for it all to blow over with a pint, or are you going to do something else? You can do ad libs with songs like Journey. So we're just a small town or a small team, app development team. We're living in this environment, and you can describe your iteration through song. You could be dog memeing. You can say, right, what was our last iteration look like in the means of a dog meme? You could be saying, hey, it's Halloween right now. What's our favorite thing about Halloween? There are so many ways you can do it, and it just starts to build a bit of the community. Yeah, I get Tim. I can see that. Taco Tuesday is not really a thing. It's probably more an Americanism. I personally love Mexican food, so it resonates with me. People in Texas in particular love it. And this is the thing. Not all retrospective templates will resonate with your team. And there's a separate play that's all about magical microcultures. Celebrating your team's microcultures by learning about them. Icebreakers can help with that, and then choosing an appropriate format that fits for them. If they love retrospectives, or if they love video games, video game theme retrospective. If they're all music fans and you've got a team playlist, do one about music. Empower the team to choose the next retrospective template. It's one of the things I recommend. In fact, build one together with them. There's a player called Field of Dreams where from the famous film Field of Dreams. The quote from that is, if you build it, they will come. Build it with the team, create prompts that resonate with them, and they're more likely to be engaged and come to a retrospective as a consequence. Okay. Final one, diverge, converge. You will see me do this in pretty much every meeting I ever facilitate. I always aim to enable a bit of silent reflection for people to get their thoughts down, to enable everyone to speak up openly before any group discussions or otherwise. Again, this is to avoid dominant voices taking over. Anyone familiar with liberating structures? There's so many approaches you can use in there. If you're not familiar with them, I recommend you take a look. Double-clicking the image here will take you to the website where there's lots of them there. I often use 1, 2 for all, things like Triz and otherwise. But you will have seen me offer many people in this meeting multiple mediums in which they can interact. If they prefer to do so, they can do it on the mirror board. If they want to do so, they can type on the chat. If they prefer to do so, they can speak out loud. Whatever those people are comfortable with. And again, I often use that approach. If I'm in a retrospective, I would introduce a prompt. I will allow 3 to 5 minutes of silent reflection. People can get their thoughts down anonymously on Post-it notes. Then I will invite them the opportunity to dot vote on the most important thing to address. And then from that, we pull an action. So divergence and then convergence. So allowing people to separate and come back together as a team to get a group consensus. Okay. When Tim, Avenge, what is the time frame we have here? What's the closure on this? Just so I can manage timing accordingly.
You've got plenty of time, Chris. How long do you think you need?
I mean, I've got plenty of content. I just wasn't sure if it was until past or.
Oh, we keep the event open till 8, so we only have kind of 10 minutes at the end for just a hangout. So you've got plenty of time.
Excellent. Right. So I think the next most voted one was format. So let's skip our way to retrospective formats as the next section. And here we are.
Chris,
Anyone familiar with futurespection? Again, speak aloud, type in the chat, nods, or do a Zoom icon or reaction accordingly.
Question, Chris.
Yes. So was there a question?
I think Mike had one. He came off mute.
I did. I didn't want to interrupt. So my first question was, did anybody else have a question? But let me throw mine in there anyway. Chris, when you do a retrospective, have you ever had a team that's so efficient that they no longer need retrospectives because their constant communication through the day and the constant improvement negates the value of the retrospective? Yes,
I have. Right. So a team that has worked together for a long time, that is mature with their practice, they don't need to wait every 2 weeks to talk about continuous improvement. They do so incrementally, iteratively on a daily basis. There is a play I describe in my book called the Darwin play, which is more of a continuous evolution. They continuously evolve their ways of working. Teams that I've seen do this, rather than wait for a meeting every 2 weeks at the end of a sprint or iteration, they will ask on a daily basis in their stand-ups, how could we improve today? They might include a blank space on a virtual whiteboard, a place where they can store their thoughts as they go along and respond to the important ones throughout the iteration rather than waiting to the end. So I have seen it happen. I'm not going to sit here and say, folks, every team must retrospect without fail. What I do prefer is to set, I guess, a guardrail, an expectation that the team will continuously improve, howsoever best works for that team. And if that means that they commit to retrospectives, great. If it means that they're inspecting and adapting how they work on a daily basis, perfect. That's even better. Their feedback loop is shorter. They're less likely to waste time and effort and get and build up frustration.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Just one from me there, Chris. So again, that feels like a maturity kind of thing. So the key there is to not let the Scrum framework dominate the way that the team works, allow them to vary from it as and when they need to.
Yeah, so again, I mentioned in the small breakout room that I was part of at the beginning of this session today, the important thing for me is not necessarily following a framework, a Scrum methodology by the book, okay? I personally align to agile agnosticism rather than any singular framework, because I believe all that really matters is what outcomes are a team focused on, or what are they trying to achieve, or organizations, depending on what scale you're working at. What outcomes are they focused on? Secondly, are their current ways of working supporting them achieving those outcomes? And thirdly, are they continuously improving their ways of working? So it doesn't matter about rigidly following an approach. What rigidly following an approach can do is get the groundwork in place. It can help provide a structure, but then absolutely deviate from that structure when it makes sense to do so. Begin experimenting with your own ways of working. Find your agile rather than copy and paste what has worked somewhere else. The problem I find with this copy and paste style is that it doesn't take into account the most important variable in introducing any change, which is the people and their culture. It may not fit for them. Okay, so back to futurespection. Again, the question was, has anyone used a futurespective before? Is anyone familiar with futurespection? Yep, seeing nods. I like futurespection. Obviously, retrospectives by their very definition are looking backwards into the past, but equally powerful can be looking forward to the future. So you could say to your team, hey, where would we like to be in 2 weeks' time? And then you can work backwards to try and work out how you might achieve that. I've created a number of templates and questions into my retrospectives that enable this futurespective thinking. The back to the futurespective is all about that itself. So what you do with the back to futurespective is you say, right, we are getting in our metaphorical DeLorean. We're jumping forward to a to be determined time frame in the future. And you allow the team to choose what that may be. It might be 2 weeks, it could be a few months. And then you're asking a number of prompts, a number of questions that invite them to think about where they'll be, where they'd like to be, and what they could do to try and achieve the success they're looking for. So as an example, let's say that we as a group today, we're going to go 3 months into the future. That's our destination time. We'd set that in our DeLorean clock and we'd say, hey, what would a newspaper headline say about this community in our destination time? What would it say? What would our success story say? You could then be saying, what does success look like? So what metrics will tell us we're on the right path? You could be saying, what risks are we going to face? And how are we going to mitigate those ahead of time? So in Back to the Future, Marty McFly has his enemy, his Biff, the guy that's his bully. Similarly, a team will face risks, things that are going to get in their way of their success. So you can work backwards from there. And then also, what investments have we made? Again, in Back to the Future, Biff grabs this almanac, this thing where he invests and cheats the system and wins a load of money. Similarly, what is the team going to do to invest in its success? What experiments are we going to try that will make our lives easier? How will we invest in our team's health, our mental health, or otherwise? There are lots of approaches you can use or prompts you can use in retrospectives. I've got things like in the Queen retrospective, you've got one vision. What's our vision for the team at the end of the next iteration? What's our goal? You've got, again, I mentioned journey earlier, any way you want it. What one change would you have in the next iteration if you could have it any way you wanted? We've got the newspaper headline ones I mentioned, but you can use futurespective thinking to work backwards rather than always thinking about the past. So again, I'd love to hear from anyone else. I know a few of you have mentioned that you've used futurespections before. What ways do you use to help your team with futurespective thinking? So share your thoughts on these post-it notes here. And Chris, thank you for sharing a futurespective template in the links there. So we've got where do you want to be in X time frame? So again, a bit like I was saying in the Back to the Futurespective template, imagine yourselves in this destination time and where you'd like to be. You've got looking at what success looks like in the future and working back from there. Simply just asking the question. Yeah, absolutely. What caused us to not meet our goals? So again, looking at the negative side of things and saying what stopped us, what made us fail. And quite simply just creating a space to think differently. This is what I love about these different prompts, these different styles, is that rather than saying stop, start, continue, you're getting people's brains thinking slightly differently, can come up with very different insights as a consequence. All right, let's move on from futurespection. I mentioned the Field of Dreams play. I'm going to bring your attention to it here. So this is the Field of Dreams play. Essentially, what you can do, and again, it's very simple to do so now, you could take one of my templates or you can use one of your own. Quite simply, grab a template and create a brand new retrospective with your team. Allow them to choose a theme and use, whether it's TV shows, and you could be using episode titles or character quotes, or otherwise it could be movies and you could be doing movie ones, song lyrics, video games, all manner of things. Find what fits them and create a retrospective with your team. By doing this, again, what you'll do is it'll be their retrospective rather than just a random template that you've chosen. They'll be connected to it and more likely to engage as a consequence. One of my favorite stories from introducing this approach was that team I worked with. They were based out in South Africa. They were kind of doing a mixture of creating their own retrospectives and rotating the retrospective format. So the Facilitation Flux thing I mentioned. And a consequence of that is someone made a retrospective template centered around the technical lead, a guy called Christopher Murray. So it basically had lots of images of this tech lead in the retrospective, some of his famous catchphrases and quotes. He took it very well. It was a funny experience. The team bonded over it. But we had a Christopher Murray themed retrospective because they built it together and it was part of what they did. So really easy to do. Grab a blank template, create the space. You're looking for essentially about 4 prompts. Doesn't take too long. I've run workshops on how to create engaging retrospective templates. In fact, that was the workshop that I did previously at agile-northants last year sometime. Really simple to do. It can take 15 minutes or less, and then you've got a retro template that fits your team, is theirs. Definitely something to try. Magical microcultures. I mentioned this earlier. So every team is a collection of individuals with their own passions, likes, and dislikes. And by using formats that fit their microculture, again, you're more likely to have engagements. I observed a number of years ago now that most of the retrospective formats out there were very westernized. As a consequence, certain cultures, it just didn't work for them. They didn't connect. They weren't vocal and outspoken. So I created a Diwali themed retrospective. I did an agile game that was built upon the Diwali lore and festival they had out there. So rather, I think many of you are probably familiar with it. It's that agile game where you encourage iterative development and fast feedback loops by getting you to build towers from marshmallows and spaghetti sticks. It's a common game to use to do team building. So rather than doing that, I had them building a bridge and having to write Ram, one of the heroes from the Diwali festival, on each brick. And they had to build this bridge, the longest bridge that they could do. And it was a team effort, and they were working in 2 teams against each other. And it was built around them rather than being a random format. So there's lots of formats you can now use out there. And some of the feedback I've had by doing these inclusive microculture themed ones has been that quieter voices have spoken out. We've had people that were usually quieter were more engaged than they've ever been before. And they appreciated the fact that someone had made the effort. They liked to see the creativity. So certain cultures prefer certain retrospective formats. Find out what your team's microculture is. Use these icebreakers to gather that, and then choose a format that meets those microcultures and celebrate them. Is anyone familiar with an asynchronous retrospective? Mike? Okay, so async retrospectives growing in popularity given that many of us aren't working face-to-face anymore. So where a synchronous retrospective takes place in real time, just like the conversation we're all having today, it's instantaneous, your response is quick. A asynchronous retrospective takes place in your time. So Atlassian calls this time frame where all these different time zones overlap the golden hour. And the challenge of these golden hours is that sometimes you've only got 1 hour a day where teams can collaborate across the globe. And if you're then trying to compress a retrospective into that, a stand-up into that, and other meetings accordingly, it can be a very time-pressured area. So asynchronous retrospectives can be one way around this. Essentially, all you need is a tool. So typically a virtual whiteboard, doesn't have to be a Miro, but a tool like Miro You communicate the expectations for participation. So you could say, right, at the beginning of this sprint, here is the board we're going to be using. We're looking for people to add their insights until this date, have the timer running, make people aware of it. You could even do it in Slack if you need to. You could create a Slack channel for retrospective details to be added to. It could be a shared Confluence document or a Google Doc, whatever you may be, but a space where people can add their thoughts iteratively. And they can be doing that in their own time. Again, sometimes in a retrospective, what happens is you ask a question and people think, oh God, the last 2 weeks, and have to think back and try to remember things. By doing asynchronous retrospectives, they can be adding things as they go along and doing it in their own time rather than being under pressure. As long as you then can't participate in the communicate the expectations, we're doing the retrospective in this way, this is the place to do so, this is the timer that we're running it by, and then this is how we take those insights and turn them into actions. You could be running a retrospective that takes place over a space of a few weeks rather than during a 2 week or a 2 hour time period or an hour time period or a 45-minute time period at the end of an iteration. And what it does is it allows people to do so in their time rather than having to do so physically. Again, it won't work for all teams, but it might be that the team experiments and says, right, we're going to do every 2 retrospectives, one of them will be asynchronous. And that gives us more time to deeply focus on our work. Something to try. There's more details about asynchronous retrospectives if you were to click the image there. You have a hand up, Gordon.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this, and it's really intriguing. So I'm definitely going to go away and do a bit more research on this. But are there any disadvantages that you've come across doing an asynchronous retro?
So,
or challenges, perhaps would be a better way of saying it.
Yeah, so I think the challenges are, obviously you don't have that fast responses between people. It can take longer to get to those insights. And if there's something really important, you might agree as part of when you're introducing this as a concept, if something is really important, it needs to be discussed immediately. We can't wait for it to be done during the action side of things. So that can be a part of it, is that it can take longer to get to those insights, to get to those actions, because everyone's doing so in their own time, and that takes a bit of time. But it's kind of a trade-off. So you might take longer to get to those actions, but you're allowing people to work at their best way, at their time. And it's taking advantage of the fact that you have a globally distributed team and not trying to squeeze it all into one time frame. This is why I recommend experimenting with it. It might work for your team, it might not. It might be the perfect answer to a team that's struggling to make time for retrospectives, and this is the way they do it. Some of the most mature teams in the world that work in entirely remote ways, they have a completely remote culture. They've got a remote working charter which says this is what good communication looks like, this is what bad communication looks like, this is how we hold each other accountable for success. GitLab, as an example, they've been fully remote for a long time. I think Atlassian are moving that way. They just have an accepted, understood way of working that's entirely remote, and an asynchronous retrospective may work for them. Mike.
Sorry, I was also going to say, it's really good if you do that, if you manage that expectation up front, and you say that after the retrospective, we may have little micro breakout sessions to manage any questions that need to be done slightly more interactively.
Absolutely. What I recommend is you've kind of got a phased approach to an asynchronous retrospective. So you've got the communication at the beginning. This is the tool we're using. This is the time frame we're doing. The first week, for example, might just be get our thoughts down. And then you might, towards the back end of your iteration, have a shorter, sharper, focused session where you enable those discussions and those further insights to be generated, and maybe the actions to be pulled out. Good addition. Thank you, Mike. Right. Last one I'm going to add here on the facilitation side of things, or sorry, the format side of things, is mixing the mediums. Again, I do this because it helps with creativity. It helps get people's brains working slightly differently. So rather than just always asking questions, start, stop, continue, or using musical themes, you could be doing things that enable people to get up and move. You could be saying, right, grab an item from your kitchen that for you represents the last iteration, or indeed your study, or any room in the house. and have people describe what that means. You've obviously got Lego as a serious play. I released a Lego serious play retrospective recently where you have people building a Lego model that represents their last iteration, and then you ask them to build a Lego model that represents an improvement in their next iteration and describe what that looks like. And again, you're using different ways to stimulate thoughts. You could say to your team, right, in this retrospective, what we're going to do is we're going to do a yoga pose that represents the last iteration, give it a name, and it's just something silly and gets people up and moving about. And then the same, we'll do a yoga pose that represents the next iteration and what success looks like and how that could change. But by mixing the mediums, mixing the methods of generating insights, we can provoke different thinking and keep things fresh. I can see lots of comments coming through in the chats. Any questions I should be answering?
Sorry, I was coming off mute. I don't think there's any questions, just observations and people's experiences coming through on that.
Perfect. Right, we've got a bit of time, so let's go to some of the foundations of continuous improvement then. Anyone familiar with the Prime Directive by Norm Kurth? Another hands up from Mike. I see Tim nodding, sorry. This may, for anyone who's unfamiliar with it, it may sound like something from Star Trek, but the Retro Prime Directive, for me, sets the context of a retrospective for unconditional positive regards. It builds the building blocks for psychological safety by ensuring everyone's aware that the meeting isn't about throwing a grenade over the fence or blaming this person or anything like that. It's purely a meeting where it doesn't matter what we discover. We understand as a group and truly believe that everyone has done the best they can with what they had available to them at the time, their skills, their abilities, the resources they had available to them, and the situation that they were facing. So, this is a question for you. And again, use the duality line here. Using these post-its again, how are retrospectives for you in your experiences? Have they been a cause for celebration and learning, or have they been more on the blame game side of things? It's good to see that the majority are on the right-hand side of the scale. I was once working for a client who had brought me in to help with their agile transformation. And what I do whenever I start with a new client is I look to listen, to understand how things are currently working. And what I'll do is I'll speak to people at all levels of the organization, the testers on the ground, work in the trenches, all the way to the chief technology officer. I'm trying to gain a wide perspective as to how things are currently working, what pain points they're suffering. Now, when I did this, I learned that there was a huge culture of failure, or at least people being blamed for failure. People didn't want to fail. Retrospectives sometimes happened infrequently, but people lost trust in the process. They didn't think things were going to change, and they stopped attending them altogether. So one of the first things I introduced was the Retro Prime Directive. I reminded everyone that why we're here isn't about blame. It's not about beating anyone up for making mistakes. We're here to learn. We're here to continuously improve. And one of my favorite anecdotes, one of my favorite stories that I could share about anything I've done in the Agile space was when that same client, a number of months later, I was at their Christmas party, and one of the testers, a guy called Dalton, who I'd interviewed and had a chat with in the early days of this transformation, he had a few beers and I was wearing a tuxedo, we all were, and he came up and hugged me and he thanked me for the change that was coming. He didn't want to leave that company anymore because he was starting to hope and see the change was coming about. It was no longer a place that he dreaded working for. So if you're not using the Retro Prime Directive, it's really easy to do. All you need to do is show it visually, make it transparent. At the beginning of a retrospective, make everyone read it, or read it out loud, or encourage on a rotational basis someone to take ownership for reading aloud, so that we're building in this collective understanding, this collective responsibility for the fact that a retrospective is about unconditional positive regard. It's not about blame. It's not about throwing grenades over a fence. It's by Norm Kurth, who wrote a book all about retrospective project retrospectives. And for me, it sets the environment for unconditional positive regard and psychological safety like no other. Many of you will be aware that when someone says, "Oh, we have psychological safety here," that doesn't mean you have psychological safety. I believe that psychological safety is created by repetitive demonstration of actions that people are safe to make mistakes, safe to fail, and then it's okay. And with that in mind, I'm going to jump to the next one, which is called the Failure Fest. Is anyone familiar with Failure Fests? See your head shaking? Okay. Failure Fests are all about destigmatizing failure. So the question I have first, what does failure mean to you? Share on the post-it notes, type in the Zoom chat, speak aloud if you feel comfortable doing so. Josh, yes, it's a chance to learn. It's one way that didn't work, time to try another. It's an opportunity to learn. It means I didn't achieve my goal, okay? I found another thing that didn't work, so I might be close to something that does. Yeah, sounds like it's a very optimistic take on it. Failure to me is quite simply a learning opportunity. I believe in destigmatizing failure by reframing failure or mistakes as learning. That's what feedback loops do. They enable you to learn frequently and often. Many people in the agile space will say fail fast. I actually don't tend to use that as a term. I have found that certain demographics, particularly leadership, failure is a bad word. It's a dirty word. They don't want to go back to their stakeholders and say we failed. I instead encourage you to say learn fast, learn often. And this is what agile and feedback loops bring about. Now, a failure fest is quite simply an event where people come together and they celebrate failure. And why would you celebrate failures? Because if you don't, you're doomed to repeat it. If people don't learn about failures, odds are they'll face the same failures in the future. If we don't talk about history, we're doomed to repeat it. And the same is true of failure. So what you can do is you can host a failure fest. And this could be done as part of a town hall where you just create the environment. You say, hey, anyone want to share a failure? I'll go first. Hi, my name's Chris and I failed. And what you do is you get everyone to clap and cheer. Yeah, we want it to be a celebration thing. They can do so with emojis or reactions, or if they want to physically clap and cheer, great. But then the person explains their failure and what they learned from it. Now, the consequence of this is en masse, we're now collecting group-wide learning, cross-pollination of learnings across teams and teams of teams. This could be done as part of a quarterly inspect and adapt event if you're using scaled agile. It could be done as part of a town hall. You could do a failure fest themed retrospective, or you could do it as part of a community of practice. Very simply, all we're doing is being open and transparent about our failures, and as a consequence, destigmatizing them. Again, one of my favorite stories and one of my examples I always point to about creating an environment of psychological safety was a single email from leadership did more to create an environment of psychological safety than I've ever seen. So I was working with a client on a large scale ERP implementation. We had 9 agile teams running in parallel. It was a very tight deadline because it was kind of a mixed agile waterfall hybrid at the time back in 2014, 15. And one day the test environment went down. No one knew what happened. Lots of people unable to work entirely, and we're panicking. War rooms have been set up. Lots of people, collective hours and hours being spent trying to fix this. 4 o'clock in the afternoon comes and an email comes out from one of the developers who've been working on it. He said, hey, that was me. I'm sorry. I did something wrong. I broke the test environment. The response from leadership was an email back, including everyone, CCing the whole program, saying, don't worry, it's okay. There wasn't any blame. Just don't worry, it's okay. We'll focus on what we can do in the future to avoid this happening again. That single act did more to create an environment of psychological safety than I've ever seen. And it's not saying that you have psychological safety that creates it, it's actions. Actions like that, demonstrating that it's okay to fail and we encourage it. And if you want teams to experiment with new ways of working, they have to feel safe to fail. So if you've never run a failure fest, I encourage you to give it a go. Here is another question. And this is all about the 0 days play. So how often do your teams engage with its customers? There is a scale here. Bring your attention to this space on the board. On the left-hand side of the scale, you've got daily. On the middle of the scale, you've got weekly. And on the right-hand side, you've got monthly or more. Drag these little timer icons to the part of the scale to share how often your teams interact with its customers. So we've already got a cluster on the right-hand side saying monthly. We've got one person saying daily. Amazing. When I do this, most commonly, I see every few weeks, because this aligns to a standard iteration length, 2 weeks. And at the end of the 2 weeks, we'll do a sprint review or a sprint demo, and we'll share our progress with our stakeholders. We'll invite feedback. Now, the problem with doing it every 2 weeks or monthly or more is it's a long feedback loop. And I'm sure everyone's seen that image where you've got a situation where a customer articulates what they want, and then the architect designs it like this, and the developers build a list, and so on and so forth. And what you've actually created is far removed from what they originally wanted. The same can be true if you've got a long feedback loop. So the Agile Manifesto itself talks about business people and developers working together on a daily basis. I encourage you to try the 0 days play. Now, I remember when I grew up watching The Simpsons, and one of the famous scenes of The Simpsons, in the intro, there is Homer Simpson. He's grabbing a bit of a uranium rod while he's in his hazmat suit. And at the end of the day, bell, whistle, ring, goes off, and he drops it and rushes off. But behind him, you've got Lenny and Carl, and they're updating a sign. And these signs are really common in manufacturing and high-risk environments. It says, days since last accident, right? Now, the way this play works is it's the reverse of that. So rather than counting up the days since your last accident, you want to try and keep the number of days since your last customer engagement as low as possible. So if you can try and be interacting with your customers daily and make that a metric that the team measures itself on, you're more likely to remain anchored to what that customer wants. You're more likely to catch things early that avoids waste and effort that isn't going to be building what they're not looking for. And you're more likely to have happier customers and enable continuous improvement with your team. So again, encourage you to give that a go. All you need to do is expose that visual somewhere and get people to mark it off whenever they engage with a customer. If you can keep that number of days as low as possible, the team's on the right track. If we're going 30 days or more, we need to try and alter our habits to try and build in more customer engagements. I see lots of...
There's a great question in the chat. It says customer, you said stakeholder. Are they the same thing?
Not necessarily. So a stakeholder is someone with any vested interest in what you're doing, whereas a customer is necessarily what you're building something for. You've obviously got end customers. That might be the delivery user who's ordering their food, but then you've also got a customer who is the driver themselves, who needs to be updated as to when an order is expected and what the location is, and so on and so forth. You've got a customer in the finance team for delivery who need to know that the orders come through and what the value is so they can manage their financial accounting. There's lots of different types of customers, but they're not necessarily exactly stakeholders. Feel free to challenge me on that if you feel otherwise.
The interesting thing for me was, were the proxies for customers our customers?
Again, consider that a last resort, having a proxy. Sometimes, you've seen proxy product owners acting on behalf of product owners because the product owner is too busy and otherwise. It's a bit of an anti-pattern. Yeah, I mean, I don't tend to encourage it, but it's what works for the situation, right? Okay. Now, here's a question. Anyone familiar with any of these statements here? We're too busy to change. Retrospectives won't work for us, or retros don't add value because things never change. Again, I see nodding. Yeah. Right, these are really common. So how would you approach a situation where a team or organization isn't yet bought into doing retrospectives? One of my favorite exercises to do in this situation is to play Battleships, one of my favorite childhood games. If anyone is not familiar with Battleships, it's a strategy game where two people will play against each other and your objective is to sink your opponent's ships. The problem is you don't know where their ships are based. So you've got this grid, 64 squares, A8 to H, A to H, 1 to 8. And your opponent will place their battleships in a sequence that you won't know, and you're trying to guess at random. Now, I play this game with groups of people, usually about 5 to 10. And in the first round, it's delayed feedback. So they will make their attempts. I have 30 attempts to try and sink my ships. I've placed them somewhere. And the problem is after each attempt, they're not going to know if they've hit or not. They will only find out at the end, after all 30 have done, whether they've been successful. And I asked the team at the beginning to estimate how many ships they think they'll sink. Usually we get 3, 4, and they tend to hit 1 or 2, or they tend to sink 1 or 2. Because the problem is they make all those attempts, they don't get any feedback, they can't alter their trajectory based on what they've learned. We then play a second round, they get instant feedback. This time I tend to offer them the opportunity to do a bit of a retrospective, inspect and adapt, maybe agree their approach. But this time, because they get instant feedback, they will be told immediately whether they've been successful or not. I will tell them if I hit, and if, for example, someone said, right, I'm choosing D3 and it's a hit, they know if I go for D4 or D2 or even E3, I'm probably going to get a hit. So they've got the ability to alter their trajectory accordingly. So what I do is I use this example to demonstrate why feedback loops are important. The faster the feedback loop, the quicker your time to learning is. And actually, by playing this game, it's a really tangible way of demonstrating the consequence of doing so is that usually what we produce, the output we have as a team is better because we've got a faster feedback loop. In this exercise, commonly teams go from maybe able to sink 1 or 2 ships in the first round to 4 or 5 in the second round. So their output's better. And importantly, they enjoyed the experience better. It felt less chaotic. They felt more cohesive as a team. They felt they were making progress. So it's a really simple game to run. There is a link, again, if you were to click here, Box UK, there is an online version of this game where you can share your screen and invite a team to choose their grid references, and it makes sounds and things as well. The alternative is you can play this on a flip chart if you're face-to-face. So give that a go as a way of getting buy-in to doing retrospectives by demonstrating how important short feedback loops can be. Give that a go, battleships. Right, what else have we got? So, one of my favorite ones, a little less conversation, a little more action. I call this the Elvis play. Question for you. In general, how long are your retrospectives that you have? Again, you've got this little scale. On the left-hand side, you've got 30 minutes. On the right-hand side, you've got 2 hours plus. Somewhere in the middle is an hour. Drag that little timer icons and share how often how long your retrospectives tend to be.
Chris, probably got about 10 minutes. That's all right.
We'll do the last few plays or last play or so, and then I'll do a quick retrospective on this workshop, and then I'll hand it back to you guys to finish off.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris.
All right, yeah, so commonly I find most teams do at least an hour for retrospectives, sometimes 1.5 hours. The Scrum guide used to say that they would allocate an hour per week of an iterations, which would mean sometimes 2 or 3 hour retrospectives. And the second question you've got here is, how long is your attention span? And again, you've got a bit of a rating. A little bit further down, we are now here. On the left-hand side, 5 minutes. On the right-hand side, 1 hour plus. Grab and drag your icons accordingly. I guarantee you don't have a 1 hour plus attention span. The current research suggests that our attention span is now more like minutes and has dropped by 25% in the last X number of years. We're constantly switched on, we're constantly exposed to new stimulus, we've got notifications here, there, and everywhere. We expect instant results. I remember growing up with the internet and I was trying to load a web page and it'd be like, and I was okay with it. But nowadays, if a page takes 2 seconds to load, I'm already getting frustrated. I'm sure you've experienced this too. No longer does the internet scream at me when I turn it on because it doesn't make that noise. It's all instantaneous, and we expect that as a consequence. And the problem with a long retrospective is towards the end, and this is what commonly happens too, people wait to the end of a retrospective to capture their actions. By that point, they're already switching off, they're already tired, they're already maybe thinking about the next meeting. So what I encourage people to do is focus on a little less conversation, a little more action. I would honestly rather a team does a 30-minute retrospective where they get a few good actions out of and then move on and focus on delivering those actions than spend an hour where they may have talked and talked and talked, but they haven't resulted in the actions as a consequence. So it's really easy to do. Try shortening your retros. Try going from an hour to 45 minutes or 45 minutes to 30 minutes. I'm not saying don't do retrospectives. I'm just saying experiment with different formats, find out what works for your team. You can use default calendar settings to alter the default length of your meetings. You can alter Microsoft Outlook. So rather than setting meetings as 60 minutes, it goes to 50 minutes. And rather than 30-minute meetings, you get 25. That will build in time for your team to reset between meetings, have bathroom breaks, and otherwise it will cause a bit less burnout. If you're usually using a retrospective template that has 4 questions, bring it down to 3. I've been increasingly experimenting with doing micro retrospectives, which tend to be 2 or 3 prompts. Just empower the team to say, what's the one most important thing we need to focus on? Let's get one good action out of it. Let's move on. Because again, I'd rather a team focus on delivering a few things than talk about 10 different things that they're never going to do in the next few weeks anyway. So give that a go. Now, that is the end of this session. There are lots more plays we haven't gotten the time to. I did mention this was a choose your own adventure style. Mike, I'll offer you the opportunity to add your thoughts in just a moment. What I'm going to do first is live and breathe the principles I profess by seeking a feedback loop on this talk itself. So the way you can do so, you've got a ROTI scale here, a return on time invested. On the bottom end of the scale, this was the worst use of my time ever. On the top right-hand side of the scale, it was the best use of my time ever. In the middle, it was okay. The way you can share this feedback is by grabbing these little post-it notes, placing it on the scale, and I'd love it if you could type a few words inside to let me know your thoughts further. Whilst people are doing that, Mike, you had something to say.
Yeah, I'm curious. If you've got, especially in scaled teams, you've got multiple teams working on a similar domain, obviously they're separate teams, but is there any value in either Scrum Masters collaborating or Agile coaches getting involved to see similarities across retros in order to find systemic issues?
Absolutely, yeah. So what I tend to describe retrospectives and what the outputs of them are is 2 things. So there are improvements and actions that the team has within its own sphere of influence to impact. So the things they can change themselves without impact, without support from anyone else. You then got the second level, which you mentioned there, systemic impediments, things that are affecting teams of teams. And what often happens with those is that they're escalated from a Scrum for a developer to a Scrum Master to an Agile coach to someone in leadership, and they then have to do something about them. They might go on a backlog somewhere, and or a transformation backlog or whatever that may be. So one of the things that my upcoming book talks about is retrospectives at scale or continuous improvement at scale, and some of the techniques you can do to find those systemic impediments. You could do a town hall, and I've done themed ones that are with snow days style, and I'm wearing ski goggles and a full-on outfit, and I've got snow mountains in the background, and down the side of the mountain is a cascade of post-it notes like an avalanche, and I call it the Pain Avalanche. I said, right, what is the one thing causing you the most pain right now? You could take a single retrospective format, ask everyone to do it once in every 3 months, and then from that, each team exposes their one most important thing, the one biggest blocker, that then goes into a central location, and then as a group or a program, you co-create the next experiment to resolve that systemic impediment. You might do the Spotify health check. If anyone's familiar with this, it has teams rate their team health based on a number of scales, easy to release, fun, support, and you get a big red, amber, and green dashboard. If you do that with 13 teams in parallel, and you see a big red line across the middle for easy to release, that's a systemic impediment. That area is something to focus on. So I definitely encourage collaboration with or creating an environment where you can expose systemic impediments and try and remove those impediments at scale rather than just deal with them on a team-by-team basis.
So I can certainly see what you're saying. I guess what I was looking for was something a little different. So if you do a town hall across a number of teams, you're going to do that once every month, 3 months, whatever. What I'm thinking of is you get such rich feedback from teams every 2 weeks, usually on a standard 2-week sprint cadence, that it would be almost criminal, isn't it, to see whether there is an overlap across multiple teams every 2 weeks. And I think we tend to, because we use Scrum ubiquitously, we tend to say, well, it's our team and that's the scope of and domain that we have. We do it every 2 weeks and we try and improve, but we don't actually look at the bigger picture across multiple teams, because the Scrum Guide doesn't say that we should do so. But I think it's I would strongly encourage agile coaches to try and implement something to go and look for those patterns across multiple teams.
Yeah, so one way I might encourage teams of teams to do that is by having a way of categorizing impediments at the team level, maybe process, people, etc. You should come up with some categories, and then at the end of a retro, have them affinity map all of the items, and then bring those together as central board and visualize what that looks like.
Yeah.
That's one way I've done that before. There's a great tool in Miro, if you're a Miro user, called the clusterizer, which is great for affinity mapping. You quite simply grab a post-it note, add a label to it, and then draw a big box around all of them, press a button, and it creates this mapped visual of all of them, allowing you to see how they will interlink. And that can be a great way of doing that. If you can basically collect the output, from all of these team retrospectives, bring them all together and visualize them, you can spot those systemic impediments incrementally rather than doing it on a quarterly basis.
Good suggestion.
Yeah. Right, so that is the end of the session. Thank you all for your feedback. The last thing I'll draw your attention to is some final resources you might find useful. So I know people were mentioning links. There is a way to access my LinkedIn here. Follow me if you don't already do so. I share most of my content there. There's a link to my upcoming book, which is all about retrospectives. It's called the Retrospective Playbook. Most of the plays we've talked about today are explored in there in more detail, showing you why you should use them, how you should use them in any related plays. There is my YouTube channel where I share lots of tips. It's where my podcast episodes go. There's a link to my website where there's now 84 templates on there, plus other templates, agile games and otherwise. And they're all free accessible, no signups required.